Hey everybody, I'm Pooch Van Druten and that's Chris Rabold.
What's happening?
We are up to episode 26. Holy shit.
I feel like we've crossed over into the other side. No.
This is day 133 of quarantine for me.
God, that's crazy, man.
And by the way, there's only 194 days left in this year. So that means half of this year I've been in quarantine, pretty much. Going a little stir crazy, got to tell you. But you know, we'll survive it.
We'll make it.
We'll make it.
If it makes you feel any better, I was in the car yesterday, and I leave my Apple Music just kind of on random, and it pulls in. You know, if I take a bounce from a show, throw it on my computer, like it'll show up.
Sure. Yeah.
I listened to a 2-song medley rehearsal. I listened to Alicia Keys' "No One" into Empire State of Mind. I'm not kidding you. 12 times in a row in my car yesterday. And of course, the whole time I'm like, this sounds like shit. I should have done this. I should have done that. But just the feel of it. You know what I'm saying?
Totally.
I listened to a rehearsal. Well, no, she wasn't even there. It was just the band. It was the band and some tracks, you know, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it feels good. And you need to do that in order to remind yourself, you know. We as a team have some things coming up, guys, that you're going to be excited about, that we've been working on. And so both Chris and I have had some time to be in front of a console recently, and that kind of rejuvenated my, you know, made me happy to be in front of a console and hear some stuff and adjust
that felt
EQ.
good.
So
that felt good.
Anyway, stay tuned, guys. There's going to be a lot of good stuff coming from us. So we will continue doing these on a weekly thing. You know, we skipped last week because we were doing that. But we're going to keep trying to do this every week for you guys. So anyway, there it is. What do you want to talk about today?
Let's do bass guitar. Let's talk about bass guitar. That's about as hard as it gets in live sound, you know.
It is, isn't it? It is. It is, as an engineer, for sure. I'm a bass player, so I identify with.
I never knew. I always thought you were a shredder.
That's funny. I was, you know, I mean, I played guitar first. But then when I went to Berkeley, I studied bass guitar. Bass guitar was my my instrument. Because
I'd written this whole story in my head that you were this shredder. Fuck me up, man.
You know what it was is I started working with a really famous jazz upright bass player named Marshall Hawkins in high school. I started taking private lessons with him, and I just kind of fell in love with the bass guitar and how it kind of holds the band together, you know?
Yeah.
The meat of it. Well, I mean, tell me a little bit about what terrifies you about bass guitar.
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty good. What fucked you up the most? You know, man, it's the thing. It's God, I have a million answers come to mind right away. You know, of course it's fun. It can be really fun if you have a bass player that does have like high-end content. It can be annoying if it's just like bad clack and buzz, but if there's something going on up there, that's the thing. In live sound, we oftentimes rely so much on the detail up top to kind of trick the brain into either finding what's under it sonically in a wall of mush in an arena. You know, it's almost like or maybe that's all you get of the input, really. And I'm talking about on a really, really rough day. And then you get in the bass guitar, though, where predominantly it's just down there in the muck. And it's that muck that typically is driving us the most insane. You know what I mean?
Totally. I mean, what I find the hardest about a bass guitar is its center frequencies are all the hard frequencies within a mix, right? So, you know, we've talked about before in these videos about how that 100 hertz to 250 range is the hardest part to get right in your mix. If you get that right, the rest of it kind of all falls in there. And that is where the bass guitar lives. You know what I mean? That's where its focus is. And plus, those are usually the resonant frequencies of whatever acoustic space that you're in. So that makes it fun. Yeah, you might have this is, to me, this is where the rule gets broken about making a record quality mix with impact. Like I've said before, this specifically, when you talk about bass guitar, you could be outputting out of your mix bus the greatest sounding bass guitar and have the room just be,
It can't do it.
Just can't handle it. It just sits there, reverberating, and it just gets bigger and bigger, and you don't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I often find if there's any one instrument in my mix where I adjust it a little bit more towards whatever the acoustic space is, if that makes sense.
It totally does.
Definitely bass guitar.
And I think that's important for everybody to hear us say, and particularly you, with because I love your record quality thing with impact. But it's like we tout the fact that no, this is a mix, this is a mix, this is a mix, this is a mix from my iPod to the show, comma, except when you have to, except when you have to do what you just explained. You know what I mean?
No,
and
that's
like,
right. Yeah,
wrong. Like we're real. Like we have the same struggles, and that thing's absolutely. It's funny if you ask the most novice of novice engineers, you give them a third band octave EQ, and you're like, okay, here, listen to this mix or listen to this PA in a big room. The first thing they're going to start doing, well, not for sure, but probably is going to be going what you said, 100 to 250, and you will make it cleaner by losing all that.
That's right.
But yeah, when you started to speak earlier, I thought maybe you're going to say something where this is the area that takes the most level of acceptance too.
Oh, that's good too. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and particularly because like you are inclined to want to clean up your system to where all that stuff doesn't poke out. But then once you put a bass guitar through there and those notes, you don't hear the notes and there's no music. You're just left with like thrust and mush. Then you're like, I do need to put that stuff back in,
I find myself creating more space for a bass guitar than any other single instrument. In other words,
and speak to that. Like I'm really curious how because I'm curious about what you do.
So when I talk about that, remember I've always talked about where no two instruments can share the same EQ space within my mix, right? So I think a common mistake with bass guitar is trying to make the kick drum and the bass guitar share the same space and have prominence at the same frequency. So everyone takes a kick drum and makes 60 hertz be big. And then the common mistake I see all the time is then taking bass guitar and make it be big at 60 hertz as well. And that just doesn't work. So I definitely make space for the kick drum. And usually, I center I mean, this is like, broad terms, but usually I center a kick drum right around 60 hertz. I cut like 400 of a kick drum to get the boxiness out of it and then give it some click, some 2K and even 5K, depending on whatever the kick drum is. Right. But I also, tend to make space around that 60 hertz, maybe some stuff below it. I'm actually cutting a little bit. I've actually boosted some 60 on the kick drum and then below it and in the low mid centered that at 60 and then below it in the lows cut some at like 40 in order to give space for the bass guitar to share that space. Now for me, it's about the tonality of the bass, right? You have to listen to the bass by itself and say, oh, this bass guitar really sings at 100 hertz and below. So
Mhm.
then I look at that and be like, okay, now I'm going to have to create some space for that bass guitar in 100 hertz and below, because that's really where the meat of this bass guitar is. But there are bass guitars where it's actually higher, right? Like the meat of it, for
Yes.
instance, with Iron Maiden, the meat of his tone is more like 200, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I find with Iron Maiden that I use other instruments to take up that space from 30 hertz to 200 are other instruments, not bass guitar. So it's
Mhm.
just a matter of finding where the focus is. But I always am thinking about the kick drum and the bass guitar have to work together in order for the emotion of the band to happen. But they can't share the same EQ space and be prominent in that space at the same time. So
Mhm.
I definitely take high pass filtering on a bass guitar. A lot of people don't do that. I high
Mhm.
pass. Sometimes I'll take a bass guitar and high pass it up to where the center of the high pass is at 100. That
Mhm.
means there's still 80,
It's
70,
still there.
60. It's still there,
Totally.
but I am high passing all that stuff. You know, the most common mistake is I see guys with the DI of the bass just leave it alone and don't put a high pass filter in it. Well, that
Mhm.
means that those lower frequencies coming down that DI line are now competing with some of what's happening with your kick drum. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Oh,
So
totally.
I do make EQ space for bass guitar to work along with a kick drum, and it is something that I work on a lot
Mhm.
in a near field situation before I'm even talking about acoustic space fucking me over. It's
Mhm.
something that you have to get right in near fields or in headphones first, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
What's your philosophy? How do you get it?
Yeah. Well, on that last comment, do I agree 1,000,000%? Because this is part of the if you know your mix, you know your mix. And then when you go somewhere and you are in that really challenging room, you know what levels of that really tough stuff. Let's say from 20 to 250.
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like from the very bottom up top, you know what you're looking for. Excuse me. It's so. I mean, if I basically I have the same feeling, and I think most people do, where competing frequency ranges simply because you only have so much room. You're better served to carve out holes, but also at a certain point, if you've got two things that are to your point jamming, it's 60 hertz. You're just eating up a lot of headroom with that. So I don't have a. I kind of just go in and see what what they give me, you know. And if the bass guitar needs to, like, it's cool to hear you say, "I'll center the kick at 60." Well, you said two things. You said one, hey, if I need to, I'm going higher for the bass. But you also said, like, a lot of people, after they've done that 60, that's the low end. And you made note of the fact that no, there's that bottom octave down
And
there.
especially a 5-string bass that has those
Yeah,
low B shit, and
yes.
maybe like Beeharv with Justin Bieber, he had a couple of
Mhm.
notes that were way down in there that I knew I had high passed up, and then I was like, wait a minute, I can't really hear that note, and I had to back out of it a little bit.
Yep. Yep. As much as I like when I say mid-rangey, I don't mean it sounds like a jaw harp, but I like
Right.
I like a
You like
Motown,
definition. You like
a set.
definition,
Yeah,
string noise, right? Yeah.
I think most mixers do, because if it can be coupled with low end, it's great, because then you just hear notes and you don't just have this ball of mud. So as much as I love that, and I'll talk about that in a second about kind of how I find that. The longer I go, the more I like the bottom, if it can be, to be like this bed of bass. It just doesn't feel as mechanical as if the kick is all the power, you know? So I kind of let it find where it's going to go. And I usually, at most, for me, it's kind of like the kick's doing what it's doing. And then the bass, I'm either cutting, I'm usually cutting in the bass to get it away from the kick. And then if I do want to do that bottom stuff, that's also via EQ.
Right.
The way that I do that. And then So yeah, it's just a matter of making them work together and seeing. I don't know. We've talked about it before. I don't do a lot of side chaining.
Yeah, I don't do that stuff either, but I know that works for some people. I tend to find that is something that I would do if, and no offense to players out there, but if they're kind of not locking together playing wise, then I would look at something to try to help that audio wise. But if I've got good players, I don't really pay attention to that, which brings up the point of tone. I think that a bass player that spends as much time honing his craft of making sure that every note on their fretboard is heard just sitting in front of an amp, I think that is a skill, just like a drummer who knows how to tune his kit well. And so when I run into bass players where before I do anything and start cutting any of that stuff, he's playing and I'm not hearing certain notes happen, then I know I'm in trouble and I need to,
yeah. No place is it going to be more apparent than on a bass guitar too.
Oh man. Yeah. I mean,
where there's holes or worse, where there's that boop, 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 let alone before you throw that thing in a big room.
Yeah. So it's something that I focus on, guys, girls also, guys and girls.
Yes, welcome everyone.
Welcome everyone. I focus on notes of maybe it's because I'm a bass player, but I focus on notes of a bass guitar. And if they, I spend a bunch of time compressing a bass guitar, right, to get it to lie in everywhere. But then you'll start to notice that there might be some holes of specific notes. I mean, I've gone as far as taking, like an F6 and doing some expansion on specific frequencies of that bass guitar, because every time he gets to that one note, it's not like all the other notes. So I just want to point out that is something that I listen to right away with a bass guitar, is making sure that every note is being heard, regardless of the overall tone. Like just being like, okay, his overall tone is kind of just okay, but can I hear every single note that's being played? So it's definitely something to look at. If you're not a bass player, maybe you wouldn't be inclined to look at that.
Right. But that's like what you're talking about, is listening to the fluidness of the bass and the notes. Like that is such a thing that will, if you're not mindful of it, you don't pay attention to it, that will leave you going, what's wrong? What's weird?
That's right.
And not just you looking around the room. It just, because the groove is just like a ship that's rocking or something. It doesn't have that stuff. I'll do something every now and again where, and actually it can be pretty often, because a lot of times players, they're not aware that either their guitar's set up weird or that their playing is not smooth, and particularly on the low stuff, particularly when you get into that 5-string area where that low string just gets hammered on and every note's like 10 dB louder,
Totally.
So there's that, which is a problem. But I'll put and I should do it with more of the F6. I've just kind of default to the C6. I'll end up with this big, huge, humongous, gigantic bass sound. But if you look at it, I've got low end getting stomped on all the time. And I may not be making it back up by just getting it down, but making the whole thing chunkier, right?
Yeah, you're doing this, right, to get the frequencies in line, because the low end is this big giant monster. You're like, okay, let's make this, squash that fucker. Let's expand some of this and get it to where it's more linear for sure.
Exactly. And then that feeds a compressor. And then that's, you know what I mean? So the multiband's just the fixer. And then that feeds the compressor, stomp on it there, and then do any more EQ, on top of that. I'll usually do like channel EQ is usually subtractive, and then it'll go and then that is a chain that could happen pretty regularly. Would be a dynamic EQ, multiband thing, comp, then an EQ, and that EQ is usually more for color. We talk about busing. I don't know about you, but my bass chain, I like it to be as simple as it can be, but I set it up as three, like I usually have three, I just copy the bass DI 3 times. And of course I'll throw the mic in there if I have one too. I'll copy it 3 times and I'll do 3 different things with those. And they end up just being options. And then they go to a bus. And on the bus is where I'll put in, this is where I'll do the like, okay, where's the note? Just don't even look. 312 Hertz. What? All right, sure. We're boosting that a few dB on this song to make the notes pop. You know what I mean?
I end up using on my bus, I do similar stuff. My thought process is a little bit, it's the same, but different in that I don't usually copy the channel, but I are all of that stuff, which is unusual for me for other instruments. For bass guitar in particular, is usually really snapshotted, scoped, so that it does change. It's as if there were 3 channels like what you're doing, and you're deciding which ones work for whatever song. I'm just kind of doing it snapshot wise, same kind of thing, but doing some pretty drastic channel changes from song to song to make the thing lie in there. Very similar to what you're doing, F6 and then a compressor. And then on my bus, I use stuff like Vitamin to do what you're talking about as a shaping, the last step shaping before it gets combined with all the other stuff.
Yeah. I just got into Vitamin. I mean, I know it's been around. I'd messed with it on tour before, but now that we have obviously time, I've kind of played with it some, and I dig
cool. It. You can really fuck yourself.
It's a fast path to destruction. I noticed that very easily, with lots of little roads leading out of it. You know,
and it is honestly one of those kind of hypey plugins. Like when I first got it, I was like, this would be rad on my mix bus, you know? So I put it on the mix bus, and like after 3 days of it, I was like, it's cool. Nah, it's not as cool as I thought it was, you know what I mean? Just because it does some drastic things if you really dig into it. You know, it's a plugin that does, you know, frequency divided space and spectrum, along with some compression and expansion. It's kind of like a C6, but then each of the bands, you can then decide how wide in your mix you want it to be or how narrow you want it to be. And you can, you know, just a few changes and all of a sudden you're like, what have I done? I've created a monster.
Totally.
So anyway, but I do use it on bass guitar. I use it on Steve Harris's bass guitar on Iron Maiden. And it works very well to kind of keep all of the definition part of the bass. You know, we haven't really talked about that. You know, the definition part of the bass is sometimes really difficult too, because guess what? That's sharing the space of snare drum and guitars and vocals.
We haven't moved up the line yet to what's above that kick drum. I know.
That's right.
I know.
So making definition of that stuff is difficult. And certainly, you know, with Iron Maiden, if you heard an Iron Maiden record, it's all about having the definition of that bass guitar work with the guitar tones and be prominent. It's, you know, his bass tone is super upfront in the mixes of the record. So, you know, achieving that in the live setting is a hard thing to do. What do you do to kind of make all that work with all of those other instruments?
Yep. Well, one thing, just to finish the thought we were talking about with regards to busing, and it actually leads right into this, which is really cool, is I talk about, you know, you and I both are not shy about how much we use harmonic distortion in different places and in different ways. And then I always say, and then I have a little extra bit on mine on the stereo bus. But I've also will say that from time to time, I'll turn off the overall mix bus saturation if I just need more clarity, or, you know, where it's a little too harmonically dense and exciting for a room or a mix or whatever. But where I'm going with this is I love what harmonic excitement does to a bass guitar, because it makes it right. Because it takes all that 80 and then makes it do 160, 320, or whatever the intervals are. It makes all that high stuff kind of pop up there. So in the event that I pop my saturation out of the stereo bus, I have a copy of it, of just the saturation on the bass bus, because no matter what, I want it there.
Cool.
So it's inactive on the bass bus at most times, active on the stereo bus, turn it off from stereo, redo it because I really want to have it. So that's to get that definition in the bass. You know, it can be really shitty because you might find, oh, this bass sounds wonderful somewhere weird, like you said with Steve, his tone's more like 200. You might be like, oh wow, I'm inclined to push this, but that's the meat of your guitar,
right?
You know, which is a bummer. So I'll do this. I don't usually let my guitar, I high pass my guitars quite a bit.
I do too. I barely let them have chunk, just into the chunk, you know?
Right. Yeah, and I've never mixed a band. I mean, I have like on a one-off. I've never toured with a band that had this drop tuning, you know, I get 40 hertz out of my guitar. Like I've never done that. You know, I've never been asked to do that. I welcome the challenge. I've never been asked to do it. So like my shit it's starting like, at least it's going to start at 120, you know? And I'll go up there anyway, because I'm with you. So it's kind of like the next thing in line are those guitars. So I'm thinking there was a long time where that thing was always, and you know why? It's because I read an article about a Jeff Beck record where they high passed everything of his at 200 and low passed it at 8K.
Yeah.
And for years I rolled with that 200 as like my kind of place, and it served me really well, you know?
Sure.
So I don't know. For me, it's cleaning that out. And then depending on how many guitar, like if we did one of these early on 17 years ago when we started on mixing 3 guitars.
Day 110. Yeah. Right.
Anyway, so if I know I've got 3 guitars, and of course I have a bass, for example, I'll take that guitar bus and I will EQ it to maybe clean out some low mid, knowing that I need it for the bass. Again, just shifting your logic up to what's above. So that's it. I'm cleaning out. I'm listening to what's going on in keyboards. I'm listening to tracks, just trying to salvage what happens in that low mid. So I'll get it from the bass through harmonic excitement if I need it. I also, like I said, I'm a proponent of going and finding those notes. I know it might seem like a stupid EQ point to boost at, but man, look from 200 to 800. Like you'll find something that'll, without having to turn the whole thing up, will make it pop. So I think I just said 5 different things that I do, but that's the bag of tricks, you know?
No, that is. And, you know, it's funny. We do the same thing. That's the thing with bass guitar and the upper range part of it, is don't look at my EQs on my console, man. Cause some of it looks like, what is happening? Like really seriously, you centered at 630 and boosted 10 dB of it. And it's like, yeah, I did, because that's what makes it glue together with all the other shit. And 100%, I was really happy to hear you talk about harmonic distortion, because that is my super secret bag of tricks when it comes to bass guitar. If you want it to have definition in all those same frequency ranges of all those things that are trying to share the same frequency space, put a little bit of harmonic distortion on a bass guitar. Like I use Sapphire, which is this awesome plugin that does harmonic distortion, or even just, you know, one of the, one of your analog,
like a model.
Yeah. Whatever mic pre kind of model that has harmonic distortion. If you leave it at the same volume and while it's competing with guitars, and simply put some harmonic distortion on it and turn a little bit of the harmonic distortion on it, all of a sudden you're going to hear the top end of the bass punch through all of that other stuff. I mean, that is, you know, we were talking earlier about a hard section of frequency range that's hard to get right, the 100 to 250. But then there's also that, 800 to 5K, let's say, that everything in your mix has, right?
Yep.
So then finding space for all of that is tough. And that's where some of these bag of tricks like the harmonic distortion come into play.
I got to tell you real quick, I'm grinning so big because you're making me think of a conversation I had with a friend of mine yesterday who is recording a world-class vocalist on what's going to be a mega smash record. And we're talking about high end, and he's like, man, once it gets to 4K, I'm like, oh yeah. Once it gets to like and above, I don't know what the hell that is. I
don't
mean, my
either.
intuition will tell me which way to look,
Yeah.
higher or lower. But once you get up there, I don't know what's going on. It's like every frequency range we mix, we're like, you know what really sucks?
Yeah.
800 to 1.2. And it's, there's all those. It's just as you move up and then you get into the extremes or either way, you're like, I don't even know what's going on there. But that's funny.
No, it's funny because I mean, we always talk about like what's the hardest part of the mix, but to me, those are the two hardest spots, right? I can find space from that 250 to 800 range. Like that's pretty easy for me. Like I can get guitars, I can get keyboards, I can get, those are all the low end parts of those instruments. I can usually get all those to talk to each other and be cool. But when you start putting vocal, guitar, keyboard, playback, top of the bass guitar, cymbals, top of the snare drum, crack of the toms, you start putting all of that into the same frequency ranges. My philosophy of no instrument can share the same frequency space becomes harder and harder and harder and harder. And the way that I get around it is some of the other things that we've talked about, like spreading things out, with panning and that kind of stuff. Because remember, I'm thinking not only about frequency, but also depth and width. Those are the things at the forefront of my brain when I'm talking about, making instruments fit. But yeah, man, that 800 to 5K is like,
right. There's a lot. That's a crowded room.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Now, some people are probably listening right now. Maybe they just have like whatever their one main band they mix, or it's themselves. Then you find those other bass players that it's like all it is low end. It's like, and they'll be like, well, I want it to be warm. And it's like, man, I want it to be warm too. But like,
my favorite one is that all low end and then this weird clackety like at the top. Yeah,
which is the most unmusical thing that can ever come your way. Like it sounds like it just sounds like something's broken when that's the deal, But when guys come in and like all their tone is from like, I don't know, maybe they have sub in it, but maybe not, and then it just like goes to 250 or 300, and that's it. And that's like that's a cool sound if you're listening to like an Adele record,
right?
And it's like a really rolled off Rhodes and this really wobbly bass, and it's supposed to create this dark picture. But for live sound, that's tough. That's tough when it comes in like that.
My focus of the bass guitar is the pad. It is the meat of my mix. It has to be there. It's kind of what's holding together all of that stuff that's above it. And so that getting that right sometimes means sacrificing meat of kick drum for me. Like a lot of guys, there's a lot, you go and you watch guys mix at festivals and it's like symphony for kick drum. It is in your chest, really upfront kick drum, which is okay. But I am kind of the other school. I make the bass guitar be more prominent than the low part of the kick drum, the moving the air part. I think if you stood in front of my subs, this is a blanket statement, but in general, if you stood in front of my subs, it's sitting there doing this, not this. You know what I mean?
That's good. That's good.
And to me, that makes a more smoother, low endy kind of a thing. So I spend a bunch of time getting that the really sub information of a bass guitar. I want it to be right and kind of holding the whole thing together. I'm not using the kick drum to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What's your deal with that?
Right. Well, it's like, that's the first thing, that's one of the most addictive parts of live sound is the kick drum.
Right.
Like the first time you pull up a kick drum on anything that has any sub, like that's oh my God, what have I just found moment. So it's hard not to do that. And to be quite honest with you, it's easy to do. Like at a certain point, you don't even have a sound. You just have this experience, this onslaught coming at you, So
because
yeah,
it creates impact, right? It creates impact, and that's what we're looking for as a live sound guy, is to have that impact where it's, making people be like, whoa, fuck, this is amazing.
Right.
And that's an easy thing to do that with. But to me,
It is.
it makes more sense to do it with the bass guitar. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I understand why it happens, and I go there too. I'll end up some nights to be like, because a great kick drum sounds so exciting, but then some nights to be like, oh fuck, I'm doing it. I'm doing, and it's easier to do it. I'll tell you something that I'll do sometimes, that aside from, I too like the bass to be the low stuff, but one thing that I do a lot of times in kick drums, it doesn't make them sound as solid, but it helps, is I cut a lot on kicks at like 125 or 160.
Yep.
A lot of that poof, 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 because that coupled with the least bit of instability from the bass guitar gives you that woofy sort of sound. So like, I know you and I are a big proponent in plugin land of using the SSL stuff, and it's hard, like on the E channel, you can't get to that. You can't get below 200.
Right.
So I'm always doing something on the strip. Now with the G, you can do something where you use the low band one way and the top, whatever, but I'm usually, I'll have like something on the strip if I'm going to cut in there, to just further define what that kick is. And so it's not too big, not only in the sub, but just in its overall presence,
Yeah, I think any way that you look at this, we are both saying that it is vital to get the kick drum and the bass guitar right and working together, not against each other. And that is a skill, a mixing skill that you're going to have to spend a bunch of time working on. And there's no real answer, because of where different kick drums are centered and where different bass guitars are centered. You have to figure out which is going to be the thing, right? Or which is, you kind of have to decide. It can't be both. You have to say, okay, I'm going to make the bass more prominent in this frequency and the kick drum in this. But when you get it right and they are both locked in with each other, assuming you have good players, there's nothing like it, man. That whole balance of that low end of your PA being correct, for lack of a better term, there's nothing better than that, for sure.
And I think that's probably why both of us don't. Another reason that we both don't sidechain, bass guitar to kick, is because, well, to your point, you're like, I will specifically if the guy's not on the one, but when they are on the one in some way, like, that's awesome, man. That's what you want,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was thinking about, just in talking about all of this, I started thinking, one interesting thing too, that in live sound, aside from what we're dealing with in the room, is you might have particular mandates placed on you from the band. Right. You know what I mean? With regards to, and we'll just say low end in general, but bass guitar, where you hear famously certain bands, they don't like any low end on stage. If you go to their show, you are not going to hear the kick drum. You're not going to hear the bass, or you get one or the other or something like that. Like, that's a whole other thing that we have to contend with. Have you had some of that?
Oh man. Yeah. I mean, I work for those bands. Those are the bands.
Okay, yeah. You're like, what are you talking about, dude?
No, no. I just mean, so any band that started in the 70s doesn't want to feel any sub information. I worked for Kiss and I worked for Iron Maiden, and both of those bands started in the 70s, and both of them don't want to feel sub information. When they start saying the word sub, they're really talking about 150 and above. Right. They'll say, oh, there's too much sub, and it's like, no, you're not talking about sub. You're talking about 150 and above, So here's the thing. With modern speaker systems, stuff has to be balanced. There has to be sub information. There has to be in your mix the feeling of those low end frequencies in order to balance out all of your, 1K, 2K, 3K stuff. That information has to be there. I don't know if you've ever taken a mix and just high pass the mix all the way up to 200 everything gets abrasive and nasty
It's
and
so aggressive.
and oh my God. So that's just not possible, number one. And number two, what they don't realize, those bands don't realize, is that their records have that information. Like,
Right.
I know that they don't want to feel it per se,
Mhm.
but that information exists in their records.
And you're performing, you are at such a place to what you're saying, like there's so much power in live sound, power for it to be balanced. You're not even trying to have a big sub show. You're just trying to keep it in check.
You're trying to, keep it in check, or trying to,
keep it spectrally balanced, I should say. Versus everything else.
Balanced, I think. So, I find with those kind of bands, like Kiss, there wasn't really an instrument up there that was making that information. You know what I mean? Like even the kick drum, Peter Criss's kick drum, like didn't have a whole lot of 60 in it. It was way more centered higher, like, 100 or 150 was the center of his kick drum. And Gene's bass guitar was like, mostly distorted, growly kind of shit, and nothing like below 100. So that information doesn't exist coming off the stage. And so you then have to manufacture it because it has to be there. And so in several cases with these bands, I have, used low air or, one of those R bass or whatever to manufacture things. Now, what I have to be careful of is not scooting all that information back on them on the stage. The reason that they are not giving me that information coming from the stage is they don't want to feel it. So that's when like speaker deployment comes in king. Where's your sub placement? What are you using? Are you using the tools that you have to keep any of the sub information from going backwards at them? You want it all pushing forward towards the audience. So those bands are, infinitely long conversations with my system engineer about sub placement. And even so much so that when we show up at festivals, we make them move their stuff.
Yeah, that's a big one. Festivals can throw your vibe off because especially now, where festivals is like the one place, unless there's a thrust, and even if there is a thrust, festivals is the one place where sound companies are like, we're building our wall today.
Yeah.
We're building the wall. And if they build the wall, but if they construct it properly and have it to where it's not coming back, that can actually be the best case scenario. It could be the most cancellation you're going to get. But if it's not, and it's just a mono block of subs, that stage is getting blown up, you know?
Like we usually, Mike Hackman will get a sound vision file of the festival shit and look at it and see what the prediction of what's happening with the low end and say to them, no, we got to move your big block of subs and split them up and have subs all the way across the front, whatever. Because if we don't do that, they have a bad show. They just don't like feeling it. They don't want it. They don't want it, But my philosophy as a front of house engineer is it has to be there for the crowd, right? So there's this give and take part of that.
You know what that reminds me of? Like whenever a guitar player, let's say it's back in the day, it could be any day, his rig's too loud. And if it's someone who's really willing to play ball with you, it's like, they're like, okay, man, you just tell me what you need. It's like the degree that I need you to turn it down is nowhere you're ever going to go. And it's kind of the same thing with the subs. Even to have just a representation that's equal to everything else is still going to piss them off. Like the degree that you would have to turn it down is basically off,
My experience with Smashing Pumpkins was a horrible experience. It was a theater tour. It was a theater tour, and it was 2 100-watt Marshalls with every knob on 12. And he just would refuse to do anything about it. I'm like,
it's the most self-destructive thing.
It is.
It really is.
And I literally did not have his guitar in any of the mix at all. All the guitar was coming off the stage, so any tonality, anything that was happening was coming from his amp, and I was mixing everything else around it and barely getting away with it. That sucked.
Yeah.
Um,
Good times.
yeah, good times. I mean, I know that you work with a lot of bands that want that low end. Do you find that there are bands that you've worked with where they want to feel it on stage and you not have to help the monitor engineer to get that? Have you had that experience?
I have, you know, because for me, just because I was primarily a rock mixer early on, the guys wouldn't complain, but they were just like, you know, hey, it's just booming, but they would ebb and flow with it. So I didn't come from the world of expecting people to want it. So it's almost like when they want it, you just don't have to worry about anything. You know,
Right.
you can let it go. I have had some kind of curious clients though, and I'll just say it like with Bruno, of course he wants it slamming. I mean, he wants it to be, I'm not going to say audiophile, but his hearing is of that.
Yeah.
So he wants it balanced, but he wants it slamming. He does want the club effect. But strangely enough, on stage, he kind of doesn't want too much.
Interesting.
And yeah, he before the last tour we did, it was somehow I had negotiated to where I could get a wall of subs. There were going to be 12 of the, what are the CP 218s?
Yeah, CP 218.
Those guys, those monsters. 12 of those in a wall is devastating. Yeah. But it was going to be cardioid, or it was going to be, actually there wasn't going to, I don't think we were going to do any cardioid type thing with it, but we were going to steer it appropriately. Yeah. So we're so excited about it, right? Anyway, Tate had made this plexiglass stage, even though it was like 3/4 of plexiglass. Man, his little butt got up on that thing and just like, yeah, totally. And he's like, "Yo, this is not going to work." So we ended up having to cut that down, and in doing that, we kind of have sub fills on that tour. You know, so that's a thing where the client actually wants it jamming out front, but doesn't want it hitting on stage. You know, but if they don't care, then you're cool. Then you can just let it go. Those are the ones though where you will get the occasional comment of like, "Is it hitting out there? I feel like it's not hitting out there."
I know.
You know.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, "Yes, it's hitting.
It's definitely hitting out here, pal."
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, everyone's feeling it. So I don't know. We said on here before, when you get into subs and low end, you know, I mean, I've always said subs are the black art of live audio. Bass guitar is not too far behind.
I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, and honestly, like I said earlier, it is really all about the source. If you have a guy that has really honed his craft and in the sense of his tone, not just his playing, then you're very lucky because I would say most guitars, even professional bass guitar that I've worked with a lot of bands, the tone itself is secondary to what the player is thinking about, which is weird to me. It's like, you know, why you spent hours in your room like woodshedding to be a player? Like, why wouldn't you spend a bunch of time worrying about what your tone is, you know?
Yeah.
And one thing we haven't some that are, you know, some that are, but there's a lot that aren't.
That aren't. Yeah. And people that you guys would be surprised to learn that don't have great tone. And then when you throw in the spectacle aspect, and especially when you throw in movement, you know, we talk about hitting that low B when you're running and it's the furthest one with the it's easy. Those levels kind of jump all over the place, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. How do you, that's an interesting question. How much compression? Because for me, the overall compression on a bass guitar is probably way more than I do with any other instrument. Like
anywhere else,
slamming.
And but listen to me. And though part of the reason that is the things that you and I've talked about before, where you can't get away with some heavy compression on a vocal. I mean, not too heavy because the noise floor, because it's a direct signal, we can get away with it on the bass. Totally. You know, to be honest, we'd probably do it some places else too if we could. So yeah, I will do if there's just one compressor on the bass, or just like one channel, it'll probably be. God, I'm glad you brought this up. It'll be hitting pretty good. Like it'll be, for some reason, as much as I love 3 dB little wiggles on some things, like on bass, I want that.
That's my point. Is that, you know, so like. You know, I like an 1176 on bass guitar. It's one of my favorite compressors. And the reason that I like that compressor on bass guitar is because the timbre changes when you hit it harder. So it adds more harmonic distortion as you hit it.
Mhm.
And so I find myself with a vocal with an 1176 just tickling it, like what you talked about, 3 dB and
Right.
stuff. But on a bass guitar, man, I'm into 12, 16, 18. I mean, I'm
Right.
big
Yeah.
that gain reduction because I
Mhm.
like it to get growly when when the guy's really digging into it. So yeah, it's and also, with that much compression, when he's playing, it really keeps them in check, the player in check, when they're really digging into it. And when they're playing softly, you're kind of getting the same kind of levels coming from them. So,
Yep. I'll say this before we can leave this. When it comes to bass, if I have all my toys and I can have all my tricks, I do a thing where it's okay. When we think of parallel compression, of course, everybody immediately thinks of drums, and that you want to retain the dynamics. Jesus. Sorry, you want to retain the dynamics, and you want to either raise the RMS or just have something else exciting sitting underneath it with that squash bus, right?
yep.
I'll do something where my first two channels of bass, the first one is like a distressor, something like that. That is kind of chill, has like a faster attack. A slower attack, so the notes can pop through, and it's doing a conservative amount. Let's say like 2 to 4 dB of compression on that one. Then I'll have another channel that's just like demolished. And I use it. One way I do that is with this Overstayer MAS, which is a saturation unit, but it's also just like a hardcore limiter once you hit it. So whereas with drums or most other things you're parallel processing, you're relying on the transient enhancing with the squished. With bass, I like to do it where I actually a lot of times will lead with the squished, because like you said, you like that really compressed sound. I want that to lead, and on the occasion that bump bank, whether it's a slap or a pick, needs to come up, it just gets able to bob up its head enough. So that's kind of, I sort of have this reverse. Ultimately, parallel just means in parallel. It doesn't mean you have to do anything specific with it,
Yeah. I
But
mean,
that's
it sounds like you're doing parallel compression, but on the input channel side of it, like not busing side of it, right?
exactly. And
Right.
because we don't, if I'm just copying the same channel, it's like it's already there. And then
Right.
I do that. So I have this parallel thing that ends up, and then there'll be just like a distortion channel to Sans Amp or whatever. And then those go to the bus. And so,
Right.
yeah, it's exactly what I'm doing. But it's funny. I kind of lead with the super compressed one and let the other guy just bounce up and down when he needs to.
Totally get it. Totally get it. Do you, I know because someone's going to ask, how do you manage the latency of all of that? Or do you
Yep,
worry about it at all?
I do. That's why I will copy. Now, again, if I have, in the rare event, it's like a couple DIs, or when everybody tries to give me pre and post, I'm like, okay, what are these really?
Yeah.
Because a lot of
What
times
do
you
they
find
sound
post,
like? Yeah.
yes. And a lot of times the post combined with the pre will phase out if it's in, like, guys just they really don't think about their signal flow sometimes. So if I can, that's why I'm just copying that channel. So my thinking is, there's my time domain. Everybody's the same. If it's me and on my tours with all the outboard, I'll make a decision. I'll be like, okay, these two channels, A and B, which is the lightly compressed and the mega compressed, they've got to have the same time. So they'll both go to outboard. And this is where you have to make decisions. And then like the third one, if I've gotten compression via outboard analog, I'm going to probably look to do this one in the same time domain. If I throw a plugin anywhere that's not subject to that time, it's this guy. But even if I line it up, it's never quite right. I don't care. I can put it through everything you want. It still seems weird. So that's how I do it, is I try to keep them all in the same time domain. And then on the bus, I can go crazy and put in all kinds of plugins or nothings or hardware. It doesn't matter, because at that point they're summed. So yeah, I'm definitely mindful of it every step of the way.
Cool. Well, we've kind of gotten towards the end here. Is there any last thing you want to talk about with bass guitar, or are you good?
No, I mean, we're talking, all of this is applicable to bass instruments, really,
Oh yeah,
synths
that's a
and
good point. So what about a keyboard that has to share that space with a bass guitar? What are kind of, before we finish up here, what's your whole philosophy with really subby Moog kind of low end
yeah.
thing that's being played with a bass guitar? How do you handle that?
Most times the way I handle it is that's often like a keys 3 kind of thing. That's usually it's not, unless you have a band where it's like Moog and bass guitar all the time, in which case you really need to put some thought into it. That input is you talk about don't look at my EQ. Like I'll get that. I love a Moog that's got all the harmonic stuff and it's very clear. I hate like a JDX or something that's just like that's just forget it. You're done. You're doing that for yourself on stage. It's just you're creating garbage. But I'll usually just look for something that sets it apart and jack that. And that signal just kind of is what leads it. So that if my bass has been the anchor of the whole show, and now that's in there, I want it to know that it's in there, but I've already established what the anchor is. You know what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. It's funny. I do the same kind of shit, but I tend to high pass. I'm going to get every musical director that watches this is going to be like, oh, I'm not working with Pooch, man. He's fucking me over. No, but I mean, I tend to take a really low endy subby keyboard and high pass it up and let the bass guitar take it. But what's funny about that is I get a comment. They'll come out and be like, "Oh man, listen to that full low end of that Moog, man. That is so badass." And I'm like, "It's not the Moog, it's the bass guitar." But all right, it is cool. You know what I mean?
They all live together, and that's like when we were talking about guitars and bass. Man, you get that big, and your guitars sound huge. They sound huge because the bass guitar filled in that bottom thing, and you're doing the same thing. You're giving them whatever they need from the Moog, but they're really hearing the bass.
But they're really hearing something else.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, all right. I'm not going to have a job for a while anyway, so maybe every musical director.
What does it sound like?
I might as well show all my cards. Here you go. Here it is. You now know everything I know.
That's
but all right, guys. Well, thanks for coming. We sure do appreciate it. Episode 26 is in the books. And stay tuned. Lots of good things to come. And stay tuned for another episode next week. All right. Thanks, guys. Take care.
See you, everybody.